You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 6th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
If the US won't lead Ukraine's allies, can the UK do it? Should we make tourists stand in separate queues? And scandal in Italy over preferential emergency treatment for a cat. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Caroline Frost and Marion Messmer will discuss the day's big stories. Plus we'll hear from the renowned foreign correspondent and foreign affairs analyst Robert Kaplan about his new book contending that we are all unwitting citizens of a worldwide Weimar Republic. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. We will be meeting our panel shortly, but first to some breaking news from the world of fashion. Currently agog at the departure of Gucci creative director Sabato de Sarno at what would appear the suboptimal juncture of just before Milan Fashion Week. Well, earlier, Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi joined our senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco from Paris to tell us more.
Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director. First of all, pleasure talking to you. And Natalie, basically, it's been a breaking news year for fashion. I mean, so many designers, they come and go. But Sabato de Sarno, that's a big deal that he's exiting Gucci 20 days before the fashion show on the 25th of February.
Exactly. I think we have been discussing all the breaking news throughout the year, and more than a dozen houses have been dealing with these exits, hiring, firing. But the reason I think that it's a particularly big deal with Gucci is that he has only been on the job for about 2 years, and there was such an investment in having him as the new face of the brand and really letting him steer the rebranding of Gucci. So I feel like it's a little too soon, and it just goes to show that there's something broken within the broader system that can retain talent. So it's a bigger conversation as well as the fact that he's exiting his position.
That's what I was going to ask. Do you think the fashion world's becoming very cutthroat? Because you're right, there was no time for him to mature in the brand. I mean, he's just done, a couple of shows. There was no time yet, to give him a little bit more kind of freedom artistically. But that's not how fashion's working these days, right?
Exactly. It's so numbers driven, I think, and having not gotten the immediate revenue rise that they were hoping for, they decided, I think, to end the relationship. But there's a lot more factors that go into a brand's success on the shop floor. First of all, for the first year, De Sarno's product hadn't hit the shop floor. So it's only been a year, and maybe even a bit less, that his designs have been on the shop floors. And there is questions of merchandising, of retail strategy to consider as well. It's not all on the creative director to determine a brand's kind of sales success. And to be fair, despite all the criticism, there were so many eyes on him. There was so much criticism from every part of the industry. But if you do have a look at what's in stores, there's so much inspiration taken from what he did. I mean, he started this story around the Ancora red color. And if you look at this season's collections, everyone has done a shade of burgundy in their collections. His re-editions of Gucci bags like the Jackie or the bamboo bag, the ballerina shoes that he's done for Gucci, they're selling out, the denim. So I think that it's quite a shame, because if he got some more time, he was starting to break through and to create this really beautiful, elegant uniform that was actually inspired by real life and real people. I loved that his first collection was inspired by the women of Milan, all these elegant people walking around Brera. So I think it's a disappointing move, but these things happen, right?
No, they really do. And what do you think Gucci will be looking out for? Clearly there were some issues there with Sabato. I mean, an early departure. Do you think they want someone perhaps a bit younger or someone more who's been in the industry for a long time? From your conversations there, what do you see?
From what I could decipher from the CEO comments that were accompanying the announcement, it's that they still want to stand behind the rebranding that they started, which is all about offering a more minimal, modernist look, focusing on heritage styles and departing from that very maximalist view that Gucci was known for when Alessandro Michele was at the helm. So I think they will continue with that. There is a new executive team. The CEO, Stefano Cantino, is now kind of positioned the last year in the job. Francesca Bellettini, who was formerly CEO of Saint Laurent, is now overseeing the Kering group. So I think they will steer a new strategy. They will continue with this more modern, minimal direction, but they might want someone that doesn't come. Sabato was a Gucci veteran working behind the scenes for years and years, but maybe now they want a star designer, someone who's going to bring their own audience and make bigger headlines.
Finally, Natalie, this is just a guessing game, but of course the fashion weeks will start later this month. Are we entering perhaps a more stable period, or will I have to keep chatting with you about all the breaking news?
I hope we're going to start seeing a more stable period. Definitely that's kind of the feeling that you get when you speak to industry executives. There was the whole conversation, especially in the last year, was this luxury slowdown after the immense growth that happened during the pandemic. So I think there is a course correction. Sales are picking up. And to be frank, I think everyone who was going to leave their job or get fired, it has all been done already. So I think we're going to see the new creative directors settle into their jobs and new chapters starting at a lot of these houses. Let's just hope that it's for the long term.
That was Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi speaking to our senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco. This is the Monocle Daily. This is The Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and we can bring the panel in now. It is Caroline Frost, the writer, journalist and broadcaster, and Dr. Marion Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
You are both going places in the imminent future. Caroline, you first. You're going to Melbourne.
You do mean that quite literally in my case, don't you? As opposed to some sort of wonderful professional ascent. Yes, I am going to Melbourne, and purely, I'm pretending that I'm going to help my dear friends and family over there with various house moves and family business. But effectively, this is le grand départ to escape the English winter.
I was just going to say, I was worried that they'd done a number on you, because I can state with complete confidence, as of my most recent visit to Melbourne, which was only a few weeks ago, removalists are available for hire.
I'm sure.
You don't need to get people to fly out from London to help carry your piano up the stairs.
I know, but elbows out here, move away, because, yes, some of us have got... Well, it's to make myself feel a little bit better about... taking 3 weeks out of my hard-working spring season in London. But yes, I'm off.
And Marion, you're going somewhere not as far away. You are going to Geneva to save the world from nuclear weapons.
That's the plan, yeah. With the non-proliferation treaty happening in April, May, we're going to be doing some prep work.
I mean, is there a certain urgency now attending the work on this? Because there are more and more countries talking quite openly about proliferation.
Absolutely. It's something that's been urgent for a number of years, but I think especially looking at the situation in the Middle East, looking at Iran's considerations about its nuclear program, other countries that are signaling that they might be interested in nuclear weapons, there's unfortunately a lot to be done.
Well, we are starting with one of those countries, specifically Ukraine. And Ukraine is not alone in Europe in frantically trying to figure out how to adjust to a US foreign policy directed by the whim of someone who has threatened to invade 5 countries, 2 of them NATO allies, during his first fortnight back in the job. But Ukraine is alone, at least at present, in fighting an existential war substantially dependent on American moral and material support. In an unpromising omen, the US will, for the first time, not lead the next gathering of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, also known as the Ramstein Group, occurring in Brussels next week. Instead, the UK will take charge. Marion, first of all, I called it an unpromising omen that the US is not chairing this meeting. Is it?
Well, so one of the last things that the Biden administration did was change some of the modalities of the Ramstein Group to turn it into more of a NATO process rather than a US-led process. So you could actually call it business as usual, that it's another NATO country leading it now. But of course, they made some of these changes knowing that there was a risk that the Trump administration would be not as interested in supporting Ukraine. So this was good foresight, I guess, to make sure that Ukraine would continue to receive a lot of support from other NATO member states.
Caroline, if the US, it turns out, is less interested in Ukraine than under the previous management, does the UK seem the obvious successor nation, rather, to pick this one up? I mean, in the early stages of the crisis about 3 years ago, it was Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, who did, in fairness to him, earn himself, I think, deservedly an eternal place in the affections of every Ukrainian by getting out in front of it and actually getting on the train and going to Kiev and directing all the attention that generally followed him around to that particular crisis.
Yes, that was a rare instance of Boris Johnson using all of his fire attracting and press attracting potential for good, I think. Yes, I do remember those days. It was all about Boris Johnson. It was all about Emmanuel Macron, wasn't it? It was various people who felt very strongly that this wasn't just a Ukrainian challenge. This was a European challenge, and this was a time to all stand together. Obviously, each of those countries has now had its own domestic challenges. We've seen elections, we've seen upheavals. Somebody like Monsieur Macron is very busy defending his flank. But I do think that Keir Starmer, our present Prime Minister, has stepped into that breach. He has declared a historic 100-year partnership with Ukraine. He's visited President Zelensky. It does seem to be divided into two sorts of groups of leaders, those who kind of think about it in the abstract, the likes of, I guess they're emulating Mr. Vance over in the US, who said quite on record he really didn't care one way or the other, and the people who then visit Ukraine and come back feeling emotionally affected and far more ardent about what a challenge this is, and that whatever you think of the politics, and people still do continue to hedge their bets because of Putin still not going anywhere, that it does seem to become a more urgent process, with money being promised, with aid being promised, with economic, with social, with cultural processes and systems wanting to be maintained. It seems to be that's when the change happens. So perhaps that's Zelensky's ongoing mission, is to make people feel emotional.
Marion, we still don't actually know quite how the new US administration sees this. We do know, of course, we can remember that Donald Trump said he would end the war on day one. Well, that deadline appears to have elapsed. But if it does turn out that the thinking of the administration is directed more, well, as Caroline cited, the mindset of Vice President Vance, that he doesn't really care about this one way or the other, can Europe do this? That is, support Ukraine towards something resembling victory without American support? I mean, Europe has contributed significantly. There has been a significant step this week as the first Mirage 2000s from France, with Ukrainian pilots trained in France, have been delivered to Ukraine and will presumably be taking to the skies soon. But is it all about what the United States decides to do?
I think it would be a lot harder for European countries to do this without the US. I don't think it's impossible, but it would require quite a few things on the European side to align quite well. It would mean that the domestic situation in various European countries needs to improve quite a bit. A lot would hinge on the German elections, for example. But Europe has already done a lot. And I think especially if we compare the state that European states are in today with prior to 2022, the military capabilities have improved a lot, and the defense industry has also increased capacity quite a lot. Not sufficiently, and there's still quite a lot to be done, but the European Union has already provided more financial aid in 2024 to Ukraine than the United States did. I mean, obviously, the combination of the US aid and the European aid is still a lot of money, and it probably won't be possible for European states to double that. But European states, I think, are doing a lot more than they sometimes get credit for. And of course, the US is a really important partner, and I hope the US stays engaged because that will make Ukraine's chances even better. But there's a lot that European states can do on their own as well.
And of course, we had this sort of almost a throwaway comment from President Trump that he was maybe thinking about sanctions against Russia, just to sort of throw in the mix. Now, of course, as we've discovered in the last week alone, he probably can't remember what he said before coffee because he's already said 3 other executive orders before lunch. However, perhaps that does give a boost to that European mission, and certainly the Kremlin will have heard that.
Well, let's move along to Lisbon, which is one of many European locales grappling with the mixed blessing of tourism. Obviously, nobody would want to live in a city that tourists do not wish to visit. There are usually good reasons why they don't. But living in a city that tourists do wish to visit does impose inconveniences, many of them pertaining to public transport and the difficulty of finding a seat thereon. Or to draw on real-life experience of about 4 hours ago, trying to get off a tube platform for crowds of Italian teenagers in fluorescent backpacks blocking the exits. Lisbon City Council has instructed Caris, the local transport authority, to differentiate between residents and visitors with different queues, among other distinctions. Marion, in principle, before we get into the details, are you a fan of this idea of, I guess, penalising tourists somewhat relative to the people who actually live in a given place?
I don't know if it's penalising tourists. I mean, I should probably also come out and say that I grew up in a very touristy town, so I somewhat understand the pain of Lindau on Lake Constance. Very worth a visit now that I don't live there anymore. But so I understand, like in the case of Lindau, it's a small historic town centre with restricted traffic already. So if you're trying to do anything in the summer as a local, it's very difficult. But on the other hand, of course, tourists bring a lot of business. Mm-hmm. So I think, if you assume that locals are probably under a bit more time pressure than the average tourist, trying to incentivize tourists maybe by encouraging them to use off-peak times or trying to just make sure that they can take their time a little more probably makes a lot of sense and probably helps locals quite a bit. But there's probably a balance to be struck there where you don't actually repel tourists or make it so unpleasant for them that they don't want to spend their money in your town.
There are difficulties with the details as well, Caroline, because having read up as much as I could about this and having had a couple of Portuguese-speaking colleagues explain it to me, I still have no earthly idea how this system is actually supposed to work. And I quote from one of the people actually putting this together, implementation will be quite complex, which right there suggests this just isn't going to work.
Well, and I also speak with somewhat of a disclaimer, having grown up right in front of Hampton Court Palace. So I do know about tourists, and for good and for bad.
Were you living in a tent?
No, it's just down the road, okay. A stone's throw. So yes, well, of course, as Marion said, you don't want tourists to feel dissuaded from visiting these lovely towns. Their money and, of course, their culture is all very attractive. However, there is a balance to be struck. I don't know why they're making it quite so difficult. I mean, France, particularly down on the Riviera, has the carnet, where you buy your batch of tickets and perhaps you keep them cheap and you have incentives so that 20 is cheaper than 2 times 10, which is cheaper than 2 times 5. So surely that would then look after the locals and deal with some of the problem. But I mean, I visited Havana, where there's a 2-tier system for locals and for tourists. And when you think of the disproportionate economies in some countries of the world, it does seem fair. And for locals to have an incentive to go about their business, to work, to shop. And one of the examples in an article that I read about this cited a little old lady struggling up the hill in the middle of Lisbon, being pushed out of the way by rowdy tourists who are probably earning, let's say, a fair sight more than her. So in theory, I'm for it. I don't really understand why they need to make it quite so complex.
Yeah, I mean, as a general principle, the 2-tier system thing, Marion, I'm not militantly opposed. I've been places where, for example, museums and sundry attractions are free to locals, people who can demonstrate that they actually live there, whereas the tourists actually have to pay to get in, which I don't think is unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable to, I don't know, for a given place to stick a £5 rider on a hotel stay to pay for the general upkeep of the vicinity, etc. But there is a specific problem with public transport which they are trying to address, and I'm just not sure it's actually addressable.
Yeah, I mean, that's very possible. And also, I think the specific issue they've got is that it's the mode of transport that's attracting tourists, right? Because it's quite cool. Whereas I don't think that... I guess it's kind of like how the red buses in London are iconic and tourists might want to take them for that reason. Whereas a lot of places are not going to have the same problem because it's just like random public transport that tourists are not necessarily going to be...
The ferry in Sydney Harbour is particularly attractive, and I know lots of locals use it just as their A to B, and of course it's deeply desirable as a way of getting around. So, I mean, it's a victim of its own success, really, isn't it? All of these things.
Well, on that thought, just before we move off this, as a general point, Caroline, I find myself always being surprised, because this comes up a lot, like massively overrun place, doesn't know how to cope with tourists, etc. I'm kind of surprised the market doesn't decide for itself. I don't understand why people go to places that they already know full well are going to be absolutely rammed, because surely if there is one thing you don't want to have to deal with when you're a tourist, it's other bloody tourists.
I think you're speaking from a very personal viewpoint, Andrew. I mean, one of the things, I remember I lived in Australia and I came back 4 years later, and it felt as though London had gone from being a house where maybe 3 or 4 people lived in it to suddenly having 10 people living in the same house. But of course, for each and every one of those tourists, I hope that they were having an incredibly thrilling London experience, as we would were we to go to Portugal. So it's a problem. It's a nice problem that these cities have. Lots of places in the world would love to have that money coming in, and I think the onus is on them to sort it out.
Well, to Italy now, and a story which both furnishes opportunity for leaden feline puns and poses profound questions about the value we place on non-human life. A cat named Athena, resident of Aosta, misjudged a leap, as cats often do, and plummeted 6 stories to a painful landing. The cat's owner, a doctor named Gianluca Fanelli, rushed the crumpled creature to the hospital where he works and snuck Athena into the computed axial tomography machine. Yes, he gave it a CAT scan, get past it. He then performed emergency surgery, as a consequence of all of which he is facing a disciplinary and possibly criminal proceeding. Marion, is it right to throw the book at this doctor for trying to save his cat?
I mean, look, I really hope he gets away with it. I do understand why you can't, as a human doctor, just, treat your own pet or treat other people's pets. I also completely understand why he did it. I mean, I've got 2 cats and I would be devastated if anything happened to them. I'm just really impressed he managed to figure out the anesthesia, because I feel like the dosage between humans and cats must be quite different.
You would think.
So, I mean, overall, I think he reacted incredibly well under really difficult circumstances, but I also understand why you shouldn't technically do that.
My provocative follow-up, Caroline, would be, is there a moral difference at all between this and a doctor helping a friend or relative up the waiting list?
Not sufficiently to prevent it happening. I have to say, I think that Gianluca Fanelli probably saves so many humans and does such good in the world compared to so many other people that all of us could mention.
What, you think he gets like a free go on the CAT scan machine?
I think he kind of gets a go, because if it had been his aunt we would have all kind of looked the other way and said, fair enough. I think utilitarian principles dictate that we say, you know what, he brings more in than he takes out. And if it comes, I mean, goodness me, he could have been doing a lot worse things with that machine than just saving his own. Is
that not the bent politician's argument for looting the treasury, though?
I've been discovered. I mean, goodness me, yes, of course, there's probably a serious point to be made, but I don't think this one person is individually responsible for the systemic hold-ups in health systems across Western Europe. And I don't think that him saving his moggy, and if it makes him a better, happier doctor, then I think I'm all for it.
He does point out, Marion, that the machine wasn't in use at the time. I'm not familiar myself with the technicalities of CAT scan machines, so I don't know whether that's a line that holds or not. Would you at least concede that there are legitimate concerns that may be raised about hygiene and misuse of public funds?
Sure. I mean, I guess the operating theatre will have to be sterilised thoroughly so that a patient with a cat allergy doesn't have an anaphylactic shock while they are on the operating table. But I would hope they do that anyway, even after a human patient.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily want to lie on an operating table that someone else was just on either. I mean,
would you be any less disturbed by a human hair than a cat's whisker?
Well, I mean, I personally would probably prefer the cat's whisker, but I think that just says a lot about my personality, I know cats to be very clean. I can't say the same about people.
Yes, perhaps it would have been slightly different with a big sort of sweaty Labrador.
Well, this is another provocative follow-up question. What if it had been a big sweaty dog or a crocodile or a snake or an aardvark? I don't know what people keep as pets.
I think there's a decreasing intimacy that we feel. It's been much studied, hasn't it, that the furrier they are, generally we've talked about pandas before on this programme, all about the stripes, that we do feel more attached to them. I mean, my mother, I think, probably fed her cat certainly more lovingly and healthily than the meals I received. I think there was a little poached collie every evening. So,
nice.
So people, as Marion has said, feel very, very strongly about this. I mean, what would be the alternative? That you have a person with these skills, with a machine out of use, and he stands and watches his moggy perish. I don't think anybody would have wanted that.
Well, and I think also there just aren't A&Es in the same way for animals, right? So like if it was a human, I mean, I'm sure he would have tried to save a friend, relative, whatever, or even just a random person that had an accident in front of him. But also there's at least the option that you can call an ambulance and make sure they get to A&E. But for pets that have an accident, the emergency service is not quite the same.
So the next time some random citizen of Aosta has their cat run over by a moped, are they now entitled to turn up at the hospital and say, well, come on, if it's good enough for the doctor's cat, it's good enough for mine?
Well, I don't think so, but I don't think it sets that kind of precedent, right? He has a specific skill set. Like if this happened to my cat unfortunately would be screwed because I'm not a doctor. But like, if it happens to a doctor, I completely understand, given that he would have sworn, an oath to protect life, given that he clearly loves that cat. I see why he did it.
Do you think he's opened a whole new door into a whole new era of anthropomorphism? You think this is it? This is the handbrake turn that all animal lovers have been waiting for?
Well, by way of a closing thought, Caroline, I will punt to you what his wife said.
Oh, yes.
And his wife, Senator Nicoletta Spelgatti.
Senator? That throws the curveball.
This is a well-connected cat. She represents the League, the somewhat feral far-right party. She said, when this was put to her, because obviously she is a servant of the public and she is also tainted by this appalling scandal. She said, in life you do the right thing and you don't worry about the consequences. The laws of man and those of the universe do not always go in the same direction.
Well, that's interesting because I'm just suddenly thinking of your fellow Australian ethicist, Professor Peter Singer, and of course he's a deep utilitarian.
Indeed.
All about life. Once it has no value, it should be dispensed with, whether that be animal, insect or beast or human. And then, of course, all things fell away when his own mother was unwell and he did everything he could to look after her, and he got deeply trolled and attacked for his hypocrisy, but ultimately his humanity won out over his principles in that instance.
Well, on that somewhat upbeat note, Caroline Frost and Marion Messmer, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the likening of any time or place to the Weimar Republic of 1930s Germany is rarely a statement of optimism. The most lackadaisical student of 20th century history knows how Weimar ended. It is nevertheless the contention of the veteran foreign correspondent, prolific author and influential analyst Robert Kaplan that we are all, right now, citizens of a kind of global Weimar. Robert's latest book is Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis. I spoke to Robert earlier and began by asking where he perceived similarities between 1930s Germany and 2020s everywhere.
It's one of geographical scale. The world is more claustrophobic, closer to each other. Technology has shrunk geography so that a crisis in one part of the earth can ricochet around and affect another part of the earth very easily in a way that was unimaginable decades ago, perhaps. So in a sense, we're like Weimar, in the sense we have constant crises. Weimar from 1919 to 1933 was a world of one crisis after the other. It was like an empire without an emperor, so to speak. It was sprawling all across Central and Eastern Europe, upper houses of the Reichstag, lower houses. You had Bavaria and Prussia as laws unto themselves. It was a really unwieldy enterprise, such as the globe today. But I make it clear to the reader, whereas Weimar ended very badly with Hitler, the world today will have a different fate, because geography still matters, and the idea of a single totalitarian ruler is not at all in the cards. I raise the comparison, the analogy with Weimar, merely as a cautionary tale.
The question then arises of what lessons we can draw from what happened to Weimar. And there's a line that you write when you're talking about that period in Germany where you say too few were thinking tragically to avoid tragedy. So what would thinking tragically about our present moment entail?
Well, first of all, is that everything matters. You know, it all starts with geography, but it ends with Shakespeare. In other words, everything is contingent. If Heinrich Brüning had more political skills rather than just technocratic skills, Hitler may never have come to power. I mean, Weimar was a very close call. There was a lot of optimism and possibilities in Weimar. It didn't have to end the way it does. So we have to take moral responsibility for our world. We have to keep trying to put out fires, keep working together, never to give up. The lesson of Weimar really is it doesn't have to end so badly. That's the counter lesson that I draw.
Do you have a concern that a plurality of people have kind of given up? You also say at one point, as the media has become less serious, so have our leaders. But do you think that criticism could also apply to electorates?
It can, because electorates, of course, are influenced by the media. And the media has become two things. One, at least in the United States, it's become more partisan. The Democrats have moved further to the left. The Republicans have moved further to the right. It's reflected in their medias. So there's much less of a center in the media today. And then there's the whole question of just general seriousness. The print and typewriter age, as I point out, was a time of seriousness, of fact-checkable, well-edited, long pieces that went into detail about issues and produced a much more moderate educated electorate, but a world of social media, produces just, angst. It produces just existential angst. Everyone is enraged about something. Social media favors the extremes, and that affects the electorate. Social media is not about moderation. It's not about complex thinking. It's about inarticulate passion.
But is there a danger, as you see it, in a desire for simplicity on the part of electorates? Because social media is all of those things you listed, but it's also very simple. It's people making short declarations to the effect that everything can be solved simply and quickly, which is almost never actually the case. You quote at one point, and forgive me if I've mispronounced him, Alexander Watt, the Polish poet, who at one point, with audible exasperation, sort of complains of there being too many people, too many ideas, and too many books. Now, it's pretty clear to see that a lot of people have arrived at that line of thinking, isn't it?
Alexander Watt, of course, was a great intellectual of the 20th century whose family suffered under both the communists and under the Nazis. Both. Yes, if there were too many books and ideas in Watt's time, there certainly are today, probably even more so. And simplistic thinking, this yearning for simplicity, is what encourages totalitarianism, of course. So that, it's dangerous. Ideas are about complexity. America was a great print and typewriter age democracy because it was about complexity and seasoned rulers with experience who understood about ideas, and they thought tragically in order to avoid tragedy because they were veterans of World War II and beyond.
There is that worry, though. You said earlier in this conversation that you didn't foresee the rise of a Hitler-like totalitarian figure, but it's not difficult to see that the conditions exist for somebody like that, isn't it? Because it is that same thing. You have that figure who would say, I can solve it, I can fix it, and this may be reminding listeners of a certain former and imminent US president.
Yeah, as I write in the book, Xi Jinping is as ideological as Stalin. Putin has amassed more power in his person in Moscow than any leader since Stalin. And Donald Trump is certainly as superficial as a figure from the Weimar Republic, Franz von Papen, who played a significant role in bringing Hitler to power. So the raw material is there. But again, the Earth is is small enough so that we can compare it to the Weimar Republic, but it's still too big to be under one person's rule.
The book, on the whole, I think it's fair to say, is not terribly optimistic. But do you perceive any grounds for optimism? Is there a way, or do you see any politicians, any parties, any ideas who are successfully moving on from that print and typewriter age and being able to successfully communicate to electorates, look, things are complicated, nothing is easy, and in fact things are only going to get more complicated and less easy?
The book ends actually on an optimistic note. On the one thing that Western civilization has to grab onto is liberalism. It's being a liberal in the old classical sense of John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, Edmund Burke, others. Because what is the ultimate simplistic idea of Western civilization? It's the individual against the crowd, essentially. And as long as we hang on to that, there is hope. Because I point out at the end, everything that I write will eventually be superseded. But we have to struggle. We have to strive on, because the outcome is not given to anyone in advance.
That was Robert Kaplan speaking to me earlier. His new book, Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, is available in all good bookshops now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Caroline Frost and Marion Messmer, also to Natalie Theodosi and Fernando Augusto Pacheco at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.